For almost all of human history, the top of the world was basically a fortress. You know, a massive wall of ice, temperatures that could kill you in minutes, and water that could crush the strongest steel ships like soda cans. For centuries, explorers dreamed of finding a northern passage. Most of them failed. Some, they just never came back. While that frozen fortress, that barrier that seemed so permanent, it's melting. And for the very first time, this is forcing all of us to ask a question that would have sounded like science fiction just a few decades ago. As that ice disappears, could this frozen frontier really be on the verge of becoming the single most valuable, most strategic shipping lane on the entire planet? The answer to that question could literally redraw the map of global power as we know it. Okay, so let's dive right into this. We're going to start by looking at how this thought is fundamentally rewriting global geography. And I mean that literally. It's not just about melting ice, it's about making the world smaller. Just take a look at one of the busiest trade routes on Earth, the journey from Shanghai to Rotterdam. The old way, right through the Suez Canal, is this massive 20,000 kilometer trip that takes over a month. But the Arctic's Northern Sea route, it slashes that down to just 14,000 kilometers. That's a full 6,000 kilometers shorter, and it shaves off anywhere from 10 to 15 days from the entire voyage. This isn't just a tiny tweak, it's a geographic game changer opening up right before our eyes. So what does saving, 10 or 15 days at sea actually mean in real money? Well, for just one large container ship, we are talking about a potential savings of up to $1 million. That's in fuel costs alone, for one single trip. And once you start adding in all the other stuff, crew costs, insurance, and just the incredible value of getting your cargo to market 2 weeks faster, the economic logic here, it just becomes impossible to ignore. And what's truly striking here is just how fast this is all happening. This isn't some slow, gradual shift playing out over centuries. Back in the 1990s, this route was maybe commercially viable for 2 months a year. Today, we're already pushing half the year, and the projections now suggest we could see a nearly ice-free Arctic summer by the middle of this century. That barrier that defeated empires for 500 years, it's just vanishing right within our lifetime. So this all leads us to the real trillion-dollar question, because the incentives to go north, they go way beyond just saving time and fuel. We're talking about a potential structural realignment of global trade itself. Think about this. The Asia-Europe trade corridor is worth over $700 billion every single year. That's about a fifth of all global maritime cargo. So let's be absolutely clear, we're not talking about some niche little shipping lane here. We are talking about rerouting a massive chunk of the global economy's lifeblood. And the current system, it's actually surprisingly fragile. The traditional routes have to squeeze through these narrow geopolitical choke points, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and we all remember what happens when one of those choke points gets blocked, right? The Ever Given in 2021, it halted nearly $10 billion of trade per day. Now add on top of that, constant traffic jams, piracy risks, and political instability, and what you've got is a system with some really deep fundamental vulnerabilities. So how does the Arctic route stack up against all those risks? Well, instead of those tiny choke points, you have this huge open passage. Instead of bumper-to-bumper traffic, you've got a low-traffic alternative, at least for now. And piracy, frankly, the harsh environment itself is a pretty powerful deterrent. The biggest strategic advantage is simple. It offers another option. It's a path for diversification, a way to reduce dependency on those few fragile southern routes. So how much trade could actually shift north? I mean, how real is this? Well, even conservative estimates are projecting 5 to 10% by 2030, and that alone represents tens of billions of dollars. More optimistic scenarios, they see that number climbing as high as a quarter of all Asia-Europe trade by 2040. So yeah, this is no longer some distant possibility, it's an emerging probability. And of course, this kind of massive economic shift inevitably sets the stage for a new kind of geopolitical competition, because whenever a vast, valuable new territory opens up on the map, the question immediately becomes, who gets to control it? Well, if you just look at a map, the incumbent power here is without a doubt Russia. With over 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline, the Northern Sea Road is pretty much in its backyard. It's got the world's largest fleet of icebreakers, some of them are nuclear-powered, and it's pouring billions into new ports and military bases. By controlling transit fees and permissions, Russia is, for all intents and purposes, the gatekeeper of this new highway. But what if the shipping lane itself? What if that's just the access road to the real prize? It's estimated that the Arctic seabed is holding about 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas and 13% of its oil. And that's not even counting rare earth minerals or fish stocks that are moving north. The melting ice isn't just opening a route, it's unlocking a massive submerged treasure chest. And that, as you can imagine, brings other global powers into the game. China, for instance, has no Arctic territory at all, but it has very cleverly started calling itself a near-Arctic state. It's building its own advanced icebreakers and investing huge amounts of money in Russian energy projects along the route, a route that it's calling the Polar Silk Road. This is a brand new artery for its global economic ambitions. And the competition is really heating up everywhere you look. Norway is positioning its northern ports to become Europe's main gateway. The United States and Canada are scrambling to reassess their military and economic posture in the north. And Greenland, which sits right at the Atlantic entrance to the whole passage, has suddenly become a place of immense strategic interest. Every major power is repositioning its pieces on this new global chessboard. So the whole nature of the Arctic has fundamentally transformed. What was, for all of human history, a desolate, frozen wilderness is becoming right now a bustling corridor of commerce and competition. The routes are opening up. The resources are becoming accessible. The great powers are all moving in. And all of this leaves us with one final profound question to think about. What happens to the rest of the world when the map itself changes? For literally thousands of years, the top of our world was a barrier, a vast white frozen wall of ice. Well, that wall is now coming down. What was once the stuff of legend, a dream for old world explorers, is now becoming a seasonal reality. A new ocean is literally emerging at the top of the world, unlocked by our warming climate. And the pull, the economic lure here, it's immense. We're talking about a shortcut between Asia and Europe that could slash shipping times and potentially save an estimated $20 billion a year, every single year. But here's the thing, we've seen this movie before. Throughout history, whenever a valuable new piece of geography opens up, a very predictable pattern starts to play out. Yup, history tells us exactly what comes next. Competition. A race for influence, for resources, and for control. So let's get into it. Welcome to what's being called the new great game. Alright, first things first, we need to get a handle on the players and the board itself. Because the Arctic, well, it's not some empty void. It's more like a complex chessboard with a whole web of overlapping interests and, you guessed it, international law. Okay, so the starting point for all of this is something called the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ for short. Basically, international law says that the 8 nations with Arctic coastlines get special rights to all the resources up to 200 nautical miles out. But what about beyond that? Well, technically, that's supposed to be international waters. But of course, it's never that simple, right? There's a catch. A country can actually claim the seabed way beyond its EEZ, if they can prove their continental shelf extends out that far. And this has kicked off a frantic race of competing geological surveys, creating this messy spider web of overlapping claims. For example, Canada says the Northwest Passage is theirs, internal waters, but the US and EU argue no way, it's an international street. And that difference, it determines who controls one of the most valuable passages in the world. And make no mistake, this is not just some sleepy legal debate happening in a courtroom somewhere. We're talking about real moves on the board. In 2007, Russia dramatically planted a flag on the seabed at the North Pole. Since then, it's been systematically reopening and upgrading old Soviet military bases. NATO, in response, has been running massive military exercises. And that talk of the US wanting to buy Greenland a few years back, that wasn't just a bizarre headline. It was a clear signal of just how strategically valuable this region has become. But right at the heart of this whole thing is this deep, dangerous irony. The very climate crisis that's opening up the Arctic is actually being made worse by the very activities that are now possible because of it. Let's talk about something called black carbon. You can basically think of it as soot, the stuff that comes out of a ship's exhaust. Now, anywhere else in the world it's a problem, but in the Arctic, it's a full-blown catastrophe. See, when these dark particles land on bright white ice, they stop reflecting sunlight and start absorbing it, basically acting like a dark blanket that just cooks the ice and snow, speeding up the melt like crazy. And this kicks off a really dangerous feedback loop. It's a vicious cycle. You get more open water, which attracts more ships. Those ships then pump out more emissions, more of that black carbon. And what does that do? It melts the ice even faster, which, you guessed it, opens up even more water for even more ships. It's a cycle that just keeps feeding on itself. And it's not just about the ice. The ripple effects are just devastating. The constant noise from ship engines disrupts whales and seals that literally navigate by sound. An oil spill up there? It would be a nightmare. Cleanup in those icy remote waters is next to impossible. And for the indigenous communities who have lived there for thousands of years, their entire way of life, their culture, is being threatened. Okay, so we've got this geopolitical race heating up and this massive environmental paradox. But what about the money? What about the big economic promise that's driving this whole thing? Is this really the new global superhighway everyone's talking about? You see the headlines, you hear these huge numbers thrown around, but is this really a trillion-dollar route? Well, as you might expect, the reality is a lot more complicated. I mean, it all comes down to one word: predictability. Modern shipping, the entire global supply chain, it runs on predictability. The Suez Canal, it's like clockwork, year-round reliability. The Arctic, not so much. You're looking at a seasonal window, maybe 6 to 8 months, best case. And you're dealing with weather and ice that can change in a heartbeat and close a passage overnight. And then you've got the infrastructure gap. It's huge. I mean, you take a port like Singapore, it handles over 37 million containers a year. It's a well-oiled machine. Arctic ports, they're mostly built for things like natural gas, not the dizzying logistics of container ships. To build what's needed in the permafrost would cost hundreds of billions. And of course, all that risk, it has a price tag. Because the route is so much more dangerous, and because rescue services are so few and far between, insurance premiums for an Arctic voyage are way higher. And that cost, it eats right into any savings you might get from using less fuel. So what's a more realistic picture here? Well, by 2040, the Northern Sea Route will probably be a pretty valuable, seasonal extra. It might capture, say, 5 to 10% of the trade between Asia and Europe. Now, that's still a massive economic prize, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to replace the world's existing trade arteries. And that brings us to what might be the most important point of all. Because look, the opening of the Arctic, this is about so much more than just ships and money. This is about the geography of our planet being fundamentally rewritten right in front of our eyes. Think about the great trade routes of the past. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. These were acts of pure human will. We engineered them, we planned them, we controlled them. The Arctic route, it's completely different. This isn't something we built, it's a consequence, an unintended one at that. And this is where we have to confront the ultimate paradox, the real catch-22. How do you break this cycle? The warming climate is what's making the Arctic's massive oil and gas reserves easier to get to. But of course, extracting and burning those very same resources, well, that just speeds up the warming that opened the door in the first place. It's a cycle that is incredibly hard to get out of. Look, there are no easy answers here. None. There are only some pretty undeniable facts. The ice is melting, the ships are coming, and this transformation, one that's going to help define the 21st century, it's already happening. And as it does, the strategic calculations, the economic incentives, the very physical map of our world is quietly being redrawn all around us. So in the end, maybe the real trillion-dollar question isn't about shipping lanes at all. It's about us. It's about the choices we're all going to make on this new frontier. And ultimately, what kind of world we're actually building in the process.